You're not in the will. Mr. Halperin, the estate lawyer, said it so casually. Like he was commenting on the weather. Like he hadn't just detonated a bomb in the middle of my chest. I sat frozen in the leather chair, the words echoing in my skull. Not in the will. My grandmother Eleanor, the woman who'd raised me, who'd been my entire world for 29 years, had left me nothing. Across the mahogany desk, my Aunt Denise made a small sound. I glanced at her. She had her hand pressed to her mouth, eyes wide with what looked like shock. "Oh, Camille," she said softly. I had no idea Mama would do that. But something was wrong. Her surprise felt practiced. Rehearsed. The way her eyes didn't quite match her expression. The slight tension in her jaw that suggested she was holding back not shock, but satisfaction. My stomach twisted. Mr. Halperin cleared his throat uncomfortably. "There is, however, one final request from your grandmother." He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a small USB drive. She left specific instructions that this be played at the reading of the will, regardless of its contents. He held it up, and I watched Denise's face change. Just for a second. A flicker of something sharp and panicked crossing her features before she smoothed it away. Her hands twitched in her lap. Her eyes darted. "My name is Camille Hayes, and until 3 weeks ago, I thought I understood my family. I was wrong about almost everything toward the door. And I knew. Whatever was on that drive, Denise didn't want anyone to see it. I'm 29 years old, and I've spent most of my life being raised by my grandmother Eleanor after my mother, her oldest daughter, disappeared into addiction when I was 7. Eleanor had stepped in without hesitation, becoming the parent I desperately needed. She taught me to bake bread on Sunday mornings. She helped me with homework at the kitchen table. She sat in the front row at every school event, camera in hand, beaming with pride. Denise, Eleanor's younger daughter, had always resented our relationship. She'd been the golden child before I came along, the center of Eleanor's attention. My arrival had shifted that dynamic, and Denise never forgave me for it. Growing up, I'd tried to bridge the gap. Invited her to events. Asked about her life. But she'd remained distant, barely civil, treating me like an inconvenient reminder of her sister's failures. In the months before Eleanor died, things had changed. Denise had started visiting more frequently. Staying for dinners. Offering to help with Eleanor's appointments and medications. At the time, I'd been grateful. I'd thought maybe she was finally making peace with our family's complicated history. Now, sitting in this lawyer's office with that USB drive between us, I understood. She hadn't been making peace. She'd been making plans. 3 weeks before Eleanor died, she'd started acting strange. Secretive in ways that weren't like her. I'd arrive for our usual Tuesday dinner and find her tucked into the study with the door closed, papers scattered across her desk. When I'd knock, she'd quickly shuffle everything into drawers. "Just organizing some old documents," she'd say, but her hands would shake slightly as she locked the desk. One evening, I'd found her staring out the window with tears on her cheeks. "Grandma?" I'd sat beside her, taking her hand. "What's wrong?" She'd turned to me with an intensity that had made my breath catch. Her fingers gripped mine tightly, desperately. "Camille, I need you to listen carefully. If anything happens to me, don't trust Denise." The words had hung between us like smoke. "What do you mean? What would happen to you?" "Just promise me," she'd insisted. "Promise you'll be careful around her. Promise you'll question everything." I'd promised, confused and unsettled. Eleanor was only 72, in relatively good health. Why would she talk like that? 2 weeks later, she was gone. Heart attack, the doctor said. Quick and unexpected. And in the chaos of grief and funeral arrangements, I'd forgotten that conversation. Until now. Until Mr. Halperin had said those 4 words that changed everything. "You're not in the will." Now Eleanor's warning echoed in my head with perfect, terrible clarity. Don't trust Denise. The day after the funeral, I'd gone to Eleanor's house to start sorting through her belongings. The place still smelled like her lavender sachets and Earl Grey tea. Her reading glasses were on the side table. Her crossword puzzle half finished on the kitchen counter. Everything exactly as she'd left it. Except the study. Eleanor's desk drawers, which had always been full of papers and photos and the accumulated documentation of a long life, were completely empty. Cleaned out. Every single drawer. Denise already took care of that, my aunt had said when I'd asked. She'd been there, supposedly helping, though mostly she'd been directing me to pack up things she wanted. The lawyer came by yesterday and picked everything up for probate. Mr. Halpern was here? I'd asked. Why didn't anyone tell me? Denise had shrugged. It was last minute. He called, said he needed the documents immediately. I didn't want to bother you while you were grieving. Something about it felt wrong. Lawyers didn't typically show up unannounced to collect documents. Estates had procedures, timelines. But I'd been exhausted, hollowed out by loss, and I'd let it go. Now I understood. Those documents hadn't gone to Mr. Halpern. Denise had taken them herself. And whatever she'd found in those drawers had been important enough to steal. Over the next few days, I started making lists. Everything that was missing from Eleanor's house. Her financial records going back 5 years. The leather-bound journal she'd kept meticulously, documenting her days. Her address book with decades of contacts. Most importantly, the copy of her will that she'd always kept in the top drawer of her desk, sealed in a manila envelope with her lawyer's name written across it. Everything's been turned over to the estate, Denise kept saying whenever I asked. It's all being handled properly. But I'd called Mr. Halpern's office twice, and his secretary had no record of him visiting Eleanor's house. No appointment logged. No documents received outside of what had been in his office files. Denise was lying. I started documenting everything. Times, dates, conversations. What was missing and what remained. Eleanor had taught me to be methodical, to pay attention to details. Now those lessons became weapons. I photographed the empty desk drawers. Made lists of what should have been there. Recorded my conversations with Mr. Halpern's office. I didn't know yet what I was building toward, but I knew I needed evidence. Because if Denise had gone to these lengths to hide something, it meant there was something worth finding. And I intended to find it. Eleanor had always been cautious about security. After a break-in 2 houses down a few years ago, she'd asked her friend Tom to help install some basic security cameras. Tom was retired IT, lived 3 streets over, and had known Eleanor for decades. I'd met him a handful of times at neighborhood gatherings. The cameras had been Eleanor's little secret. Better safe than sorry, she'd told me once with a wink. And I like knowing what's happening in my own home. I'd driven to Tom's house on a Tuesday afternoon, hoping he'd remember me. When he opened the door, recognition crossed his face immediately. Camille. I was so sorry to hear about Eleanor. She was a wonderful woman. Thank you, I'd said. Tom, I need to ask you something about the security cameras you installed for her. Do they back up footage anywhere? He'd hesitated, reading something in my expression. They back up to a local drive. Why? I think my aunt might have taken some things from the house. Important documents. I need to know if there's any footage from the weeks before Grandma died. Tom had studied me for a long moment. Then he nodded. Come in. Let me check what I can recover. We'd spent 2 hours going through backup files. Most were routine. Eleanor moving through her house, reading, cooking, living her quiet life. Then Tom had frozen the screen. Camille, he'd said quietly. You need to see this. The footage was from 2 weeks before Eleanor died. Late at night, around 11. The timestamp glowed in the corner of the screen. Denise entered Eleanor's study. She wasn't supposed to be there. She'd told everyone she was staying at a hotel during her visits, that Eleanor's guest room was too uncomfortable. But here she was, moving through the dark house with obvious familiarity. She'd gone straight to Eleanor's desk and started pulling papers from the drawers. Files. Documents. She'd spread them across the desk, photographing some with her phone, reading others carefully. Then she'd turned on Eleanor's printer. I watched as she fed paper into the machine, printed multiple pages, compared them to documents from the desk. She was replacing something. Rewriting something. The footage continued. Denise worked for nearly an hour, completely focused. Then the study door had opened. Eleanor stood in the doorway in her nightgown, her face twisted with fury. The camera had no audio, but I could read their body language. Eleanor was shouting. Denise was defensive, gesturing at the papers. Eleanor had grabbed them, but Denise had snatched them back. The argument had escalated. Eleanor had pointed toward the door, clearly ordering Denise to leave. My aunt had gathered the papers and left, but not before turning back to say something that made Eleanor sink into her desk chair, her face buried in her hands. "Can you copy this?" I'd asked Tom, my voice shaking. He'd already been burning it to a drive. With the footage secured, I started analyzing the will that Mr. Halpern had read. The one where I'd been excluded entirely. The one that left everything to Denise. Eleanor had always been meticulous about her estate planning. She'd talked about it often, wanting to make sure everything was clear and fair. She'd always mentioned 3 things specifically. Her house would go to me, because I'd been the one taking care of her. A significant donation would go to Haven House, the women's shelter where she'd volunteered for 20 years. The remainder would be split between me and Denise equally. But this new will was different. Everything went to Denise. No mention of Haven House. No provision for me at all. And crucially, no mention of Eleanor's wishes about being buried next to her late husband, something she'd talked about constantly. I pulled out the copy I'd made before leaving Mr. Halpern's office and read through it line by line. The language was formal, legal, but certain phrases felt wrong. Too modern. Too detached from Eleanor's voice. My grandmother had included personal notes in her previous will, little messages explaining her choices. This one was cold. Clinical. I started researching will fraud. What it looked like. How it was done. How often family members got away with it. The statistics were depressing. Most cases never went to trial. Most victims never knew they'd been cheated. But I wasn't most victims. And I had something most people didn't have. Evidence. Darla Knox had been Eleanor's nurse during the final months. She'd come 3 times a week to help with medications, check vitals, provide companionship. Eleanor had loved her, often saying Darla was the daughter she'd wished she'd had. I'd tracked Darla down through the home health agency. She'd agreed to meet me at a coffee shop downtown, and when she'd walked in, I'd seen the sadness in her eyes. "Your grandmother was special," Darla had said, settling into her chair. "I still can't believe she's gone. Darla, I need to ask you something important. In the weeks before Grandma died, did she seem confused? Disoriented? Like she didn't understand what was happening around her?" Darla had shaken her head firmly. "Absolutely not." Eleanor was sharp as a tack right up until the end. "We'd do crosswords together, and she'd beat me every time. She remembered everything, asked detailed questions about my family, made plans for her garden. Did she ever mention being worried about anything? About anyone?" Darla had paused, choosing her words carefully. "About 2 weeks before she passed, Eleanor mentioned that someone was tampering with her documents. She didn't say who, but she was upset about it. Said she needed to protect what she'd built." Did she seem competent when she said this? Like she knew what she was talking about? Completely, Darla had confirmed. I'd stake my nursing license on it. Eleanor was of sound mind right up until her heart attack. I'd thanked her and asked if she'd be willing to provide a written statement to that effect. She'd agreed immediately. My next meeting with Mr. Halpern was scheduled for the following Tuesday. I'd requested it under the pretense of asking questions about the estate settlement. He'd seemed reluctant but had agreed. His office was downtown, in a building that tried too hard to look prestigious. The waiting room smelled like leather and anxiety. When I'd been shown into his office, Mr. Halpern had looked nervous. Fidgeting with his pen. Avoiding eye contact. "How can I help you, Ms. Hayes?" "I have some questions about Grandma's will," I'd said calmly. Specifically about when it was updated. He'd shifted in his chair. "As I mentioned at the reading, the will was updated shortly before your grandmother's passing. How shortly? About 4 days before. And she came here to sign it? Silence. Long enough to be damning. Ms. Hayes, estate matters are confidential. Mr. Halperin, did my grandmother come to this office 4 days before she died to sign a new will? He'd cleared his throat. Your aunt brought the updated will. She explained that Eleanor was too tired to make the trip, but that she'd signed it at home. And you accepted that? Without verifying Eleanor's signature? Without ensuring she understood what she was signing? His face had flushed. Your aunt provided medical documentation suggesting your grandmother's health was declining rapidly. I made a judgment call. I'd leaned forward. What kind of medical documentation? Letters from her doctors. Statements about her cognitive state. Can I see them? They're confidential medical, they're fake, I'd said quietly. And I think you know that. Mr. Halperin had gone pale. But I hadn't pushed further. Not yet. I'd decided to play along. To be the grieving, confused niece who didn't understand legal matters and wasn't going to cause trouble. In family gatherings, I'd been quiet and subdued. When Denise had called to discuss dividing up Eleanor's belongings, I'd been accommodating. Whatever you think is fair, I'd said. I just want this to be easy. I could hear the relief in Denise's voice. She thought I was giving up. Accepting my fate. Moving on. Meanwhile, I was building my case. I'd contacted Eleanor's doctors. None of them had written letters about her cognitive decline. In fact, her last checkup, 2 weeks before her death, had noted she was mentally acute and in good spirits. I'd gotten copies of all her medical records. I'd found the original contractor who'd done work on Eleanor's house 5 years ago and gotten a copy of the invoice that Eleanor had always said she'd kept. It matched nothing in the new will's asset list. I'd interviewed 3 of Eleanor's closest friends, all of whom confirmed she'd recently talked about updating her will to make sure I was taken care of. And I'd kept the security footage safe. Backed up in 3 different locations. Because I knew Denise. She was arrogant enough to think she'd gotten away with it. But she'd made one critical mistake. She'd underestimated me. And she was about to learn exactly what that cost. Tom had called me on a Wednesday evening, his voice urgent. Camille, I kept digging through the backup files. There's something else. What did you find? An audio file. Buried in a system backup folder that Eleanor probably didn't even know existed. It's dated 3 days before she died. My hands had started shaking. Can you send it to me? I think you should come here and listen to it first. I'd driven to Tom's house immediately. He'd loaded the file on his computer, and we'd sat in silence as Eleanor's voice filled the room. My name is Eleanor Hayes, and today is March 15th. I'm recording this because I need people to know the truth if anything happens to me. Her voice had been strong. Clear. No trace of confusion or uncertainty. My daughter Denise has been trying to change my will without my knowledge. 2 weeks ago, I caught her in my study with documents she'd created, attempting to replace my actual will with a forged version. I confronted her. She claimed she was only trying to help, that she wanted to make sure my estate was handled properly. But I know what I saw. Eleanor had paused. The recording had captured the sound of her taking a sip of something. Tea, probably. I've updated my actual will with my lawyer, the one I trust. I've included a video statement that explains everything. If someone is listening to this audio file, it means they're looking for the truth. And the truth is simple. I want Camille to have everything I've worked for. Not because she asked for it. She never asked for anything. But because she stayed. She cared. She loved me without conditions. The recording had ended. I'd sat in Tom's office with tears streaming down my face. My grandmother had known. She'd protected me even after death. She mentioned a video, I'd said to Tom, wiping my eyes. Where would she have stored that? Tom had thought for a moment. If Eleanor wanted something absolutely secure, she probably gave it to her lawyer. The real one, not this Halperin character who's been playing along with your aunt. She had another lawyer? She must have. Think about it. If she knew Denise was trying to forge documents, she wouldn't have gone back to the same lawyer Denise had access to. I'd started searching through Eleanor's contacts. Old address books, phone records, anything that might point to another legal professional. Then I'd remembered something. A business card I'd seen in Eleanor's wallet at the hospital. I'd kept her personal effects in a box in my closet, too painful to sort through. Now I'd torn through it frantically. And there it was. Harrison and Associates. Estate planning and probate. An address across town. A different lawyer entirely. I'd called the next morning. This is Camille Hayes. My grandmother Eleanor Hayes recently passed away, and I believe she may have updated her will with your firm. The receptionist had put me on hold. Then a man's voice had come on the line. Ms. Hayes, this is Preston Harrison. I've been expecting your call. Your grandmother left very specific instructions. When can you come in? When I'd arrived at his office, Preston Harrison had greeted me with sympathy and something else. Satisfaction. Like he'd been waiting for this moment. Your grandmother was brilliant, he'd said, pulling out a thick file. She knew exactly what your aunt was planning. And she prepared accordingly. Preston had laid it all out. Eleanor had come to him 6 weeks before her death, right after catching Denise in her study. She'd explained the situation and asked Preston to prepare an ironclad will that couldn't be contested. She was very specific, Preston had explained. She wanted everything documented. Every asset, every decision, every reasoning behind her choices. And she insisted on creating a video testimony that would be played in the event of any dispute. Why didn't you come forward when Mr. Halperin read the other will? I'd asked. Because your grandmother's instructions were clear. She said Denise would try to circumvent the real will. She wanted to give her daughter enough rope to hang herself with. Her words, not mine. Preston had pulled out another document. This is the real will. Everything to you, with the exception of a substantial donation to Haven House. There's a personal letter to you explaining her choices. And there's the video testimony, to be played only in the event that someone contests the will or attempts to claim there was another version. Has anyone registered the fake will with probate? I'd asked. Your aunt filed it 3 days ago, Preston had confirmed. Which means we can now file the challenge and present the real will. Your grandmother predicted this exact scenario. I'd sat back in my chair, overwhelmed. Eleanor had outmaneuvered Denise from beyond the grave. What do I need to do? Let me handle the legal filing. But there's something else your grandmother wanted. She asked that if it came to a court hearing, you be the one to present the video. She said you deserved to see Denise's face when the truth came out. Denise had thrown a dinner party. A celebration, she'd called it, though everyone knew what she was really celebrating. She'd won. She'd gotten the inheritance. She'd successfully cut me out of Eleanor's estate. The dinner was at an expensive restaurant downtown. Extended family had been invited. Cousins I barely knew. Eleanor's old bridge partners. People from her church. Denise had held court at the head of the table, talking about her plans for Eleanor's house. I'm thinking of renovating the kitchen, she'd said, swirling wine in her glass. Maybe opening up that wall to create more space. It's going to be a real showpiece. I'd sat quietly at the far end of the table, pushing food around my plate. Such a shame about the shelter donation, one of Eleanor's church friends had mentioned. Eleanor always talked about supporting Haven House. Denise had waved her hand dismissively. Mama changed her mind in her final days. She wanted the money to stay in the family. The friend had looked uncomfortable but hadn't pushed further. Then Denise had looked directly at me. It must be difficult, Camille. But you have to understand, you were never really Eleanor's. Not in the way that matters. Blood is blood. The table had gone quiet. Several people had looked at me with pity. I'd smiled. Set down my fork carefully. You're right, Denise. Blood is blood. And the truth always comes out eventually. Her eyes had narrowed slightly. But she'd laughed it off. Is that a threat? Just an observation, I'd said calmly. Inside, I'd been counting down. 5 days until the court hearing. The probate court hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning at 9. Denise had arrived confident, her lawyer by her side. She'd worn black, the grieving daughter performing her role perfectly. I'd arrived with Preston Harrison. Denise had barely glanced at me, assuming I was there to accept defeat formally. The courtroom was small, wood-paneled, formal. Judge Patricia Vance presided, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and no patience for games. "We're here regarding the estate of Eleanor Hayes," Judge Vance had begun. MS. Denise Carter has filed a will dated 4 days before Mrs. Hayes's death. Is there any contest to this document? Preston had stood. Yes, Your Honor. We're filing a formal challenge. We have evidence that the will submitted by Ms. Carter is fraudulent and that there exists a valid, properly executed will that supersedes it. Denise's lawyer had jumped up. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The will in question was properly witnessed and notarized. By a notary your client hired privately, Preston had interrupted. Not by Mrs. Hayes's long-standing legal counsel. Judge Vance had raised her hand. I want to see all documentation from both parties. And I want to understand the basis for this challenge. Preston had presented everything methodically. The security footage showing Denise in Eleanor's study. The medical records proving Eleanor was competent. Darla's testimony. The audio recording of Eleanor's concerns. With each piece of evidence, I'd watched Denise's face change. Confidence cracking into concern, then fear, then barely contained panic. Your Honor, Preston had said quietly, there's one more piece of evidence. A video testimony recorded by Mrs. Hayes. She specifically requested it be played in the event of any dispute. Judge Vance had reviewed the documentation, her expression growing darker. This is a very serious accusation, Mr. Harrison. You're claiming that Ms. Carter forged her own mother's will? I'm presenting evidence and letting the court decide, Your Honor. The judge had turned to Denise. Ms. Carter, do you have any response to these allegations? Denise's lawyer had whispered urgently in her ear. She'd composed herself, but I could see the tremor in her hands. Your Honor, my mother was very ill in her final days. She was confused, often paranoid. These recordings, this so-called evidence, it's all taken out of context. I was simply trying to help her organize her affairs. By creating a new will that excluded her granddaughter and her favorite charity? Judge Vance had asked pointedly. By honoring what I believed were her actual wishes. Camille was always complicated. My mother felt obligated to her, but that's not the same as love. The judge had looked at me then. Ms. Hayes, Mr. Harrison indicated you'd like to present Mrs. Hayes's video testimony? I'd stood, my legs shaking but my voice steady. Yes, Your Honor. My grandmother recorded this 6 weeks before her death with her actual attorney. She wanted her true wishes known. Preston had set up the laptop and projector. The lights in the courtroom had dimmed. And Eleanor's face had appeared on the screen, sitting in Preston Harrison's office, looking directly into the camera. Looking at me, at Denise, at everyone who doubted her clarity or her choices. My name is Eleanor Hayes, she'd begun. And I'm here to tell you the truth about my daughter. Eleanor's voice had filled the courtroom, strong and clear. Every word precisely chosen. If you're watching this, it means someone has contested my will. And I think I know exactly who it is. My daughter Denise has spent the last several months attempting to manipulate my estate. She's tried to forge documents, to change my wishes, to cut out the person I love most in this world. On screen, Eleanor had leaned forward slightly. Let me be absolutely clear. I am of sound mind. I am not confused. I am not being manipulated. And I am making these choices freely and with full understanding of their implications. She'd paused, and I'd seen tears in her eyes. Denise, if you're hearing this, I want you to know I'm disappointed. Not surprised, but disappointed. You've always put money before family, appearances before love. I tried to teach you differently. I failed. The camera had captured Eleanor wiping her eyes before continuing. Camille has been my joy in these later years. She never asked me for anything. Never expected anything. She just loved me. Took care of me. Made me laugh. That's why I'm leaving everything to her. Not because I'm punishing you, Denise, but because Camille has already given me more than you ever could. Eleanor had looked directly into the camera then. At me. Camille, sweetheart, don't let anyone make you feel like you didn't deserve this. You earned it through kindness and loyalty. Use it well. And remember, I loved you more than I ever found the words to say. The video had ended. The courtroom had been silent. Denise had started to stand, to object, but her lawyer had pulled her back down. Her face had been white, her hands gripping the table's edge. Judge Vance had removed her glasses and cleaned them slowly, deliberately. A mess. Carter, I'm going to ask you one time. Is there anything you'd like to say in response to this testimony? Denise had opened her mouth, but nothing had come out. She'd looked at me then, really looked at me, and I'd seen everything in her face. Rage. Humiliation. The dawning realization that she'd lost. Your Honor, her lawyer had said weakly, we'd like to request time to review this new evidence. There's nothing to review, Judge Vance had interrupted. Mrs. Hayes's testimony is clear. Her competency is documented. And the evidence of document tampering is overwhelming. I'm voiding the will submitted by Ms. Carter and recognizing the will prepared by Harrison and Associates as valid and binding. She'd turned to Denise. I could refer this matter to the district attorney for prosecution of fraud and forgery. The evidence certainly supports criminal charges. Denise had made a small sound, like something breaking. However, Judge Vance had continued, looking at me, that decision ultimately rests with the estate's beneficiary. Ms. Hayes, do you wish to pursue criminal charges against your aunt? Every eye in the courtroom had turned to me. This was my moment. My choice. I'd looked at Denise, at this woman who tried to erase me from my grandmother's life, who'd spent months plotting and scheming and lying. I could destroy her completely. One word, and she'd face criminal prosecution. Possible jail time. Definitely public humiliation and legal consequences that would follow her for years. I'd thought about Eleanor. About what she would have wanted. No, I'd said quietly. I don't want to press charges. Denise's relief had been visible. But I'd held up my hand. I don't need to. She's already lost everything that matters. Judge Vance had issued her final ruling. The estate would transfer to me per Eleanor's actual will. Haven House would receive its donation. Denise would receive nothing except a small box of personal photographs Eleanor had set aside, a final gesture of love from a mother who couldn't quite let go entirely. The extended family had been notified immediately. Eleanor's church friends. Her bridge partners. The cousins and distant relatives who'd attended Denise's celebratory dinner. Word spread through their community like wildfire. Denise Carter had tried to forge her own mother's will. Had tried to steal from her niece. Had been caught and publicly humiliated in court. The dinner invitations stopped. The friendly calls dried up. People who'd known Denise for decades suddenly didn't recognize her at the grocery store. Her women's club quietly asked her to resign. Her name was removed from charity boards. She'd built her entire identity on being Eleanor Hayes's daughter. On being part of that family legacy. Now that identity was ashes. I'd heard through mutual acquaintances that she'd left town entirely. Moved somewhere across the state where nobody knew the story. Started over with nothing but the clothes in her suitcase and the weight of what she'd done. I felt nothing about it. Not satisfaction, not pity. Just a quiet sense of justice served. She'd tried to rewrite history, to erase me, to steal what Eleanor had wanted me to have. And in doing so, she'd lost everything. Including the one thing she'd actually inherited, her mother's memory in others' eyes. Walking through Eleanor's house for the first time as its legal owner felt surreal. My house now. Every room filled with memories. The kitchen where we'd baked together. The living room where we'd watched old movies. The study where Denise had tried to steal my future. I'd gone to Eleanor's jewelry box and found what I'd been looking for. Her charm bracelet. Silver, worn soft with age, covered in tiny charms she'd collected throughout her life. A tiny book for her love of reading. A miniature house for her first home. A heart engraved with my grandfather's initials. And at the end, a charm she'd added shortly before she died. A small bird taking flight. I'd put it on immediately. It jingled softly on my wrist as I moved through the house, making plans. The first call I'd made had been to Haven House. "This is Camille Hayes, Eleanor Hayes's granddaughter. I wanted to let you know that Grandma's donation is coming through as she intended. $200,000 for the new women's wing." The director had cried. They'd named the wing after Eleanor. A plaque would go up with her photo and a quote she'd loved: "We rise by lifting others." I'd kept every promise Eleanor had wanted kept. Donated to her favorite charities. Maintained her garden exactly as she'd designed it. Invited her friends over for tea in her memory. The house became a living tribute to the woman who'd saved me. Who'd loved me. Who'd protected me even after death. Months passed. Spring turned to summer. I'd settled into the house completely, making it my own while honoring Eleanor's presence. I'd kept her photos on the mantel. Her books on the shelves. But I'd added my own touches too. Plants in the windows. New curtains. A desk in the study where I worked on my writing. My phone had stayed quiet. Denise had never called. Never texted. Never reached out to apologize or explain or beg for forgiveness. The silence had been deliberate on both our parts. She had nothing to say that I wanted to hear. I had nothing to offer her that she deserved. One afternoon, Eleanor's bridge partner stopped by with a casserole. "I heard Denise is working retail now," she'd mentioned casually. "Some little shop in a strip mall." Can you imagine? I could imagine. Denise, who dreamed of luxury and status, reduced to minimum wage and anonymity. Who'd plotted to steal hundreds of thousands of dollars, now counting pennies. The karma was almost poetic. "I don't think about her much," I'd said truthfully. "She's not worth the energy." The woman had patted my hand. "Eleanor would be so proud of you. The way you handled everything with grace. Never stooping to her level." But it hadn't been grace, not really. It had been strategy. I'd learned from Eleanor to be methodical. To gather evidence. To wait for the right moment. To let my enemies defeat themselves. Denise hadn't lost because I destroyed her. She'd lost because she'd destroyed herself. I just made sure everyone saw it happen. I'd started running Eleanor's old artisan goods business from the house. She'd made soaps and candles, selling them at farmers markets and craft fairs. It had been her joy, her creative outlet. Now it was mine. The spare bedroom had become my workspace, filled with supplies and scents. Lavender and vanilla. Eucalyptus and mint. Each batch made according to Eleanor's recipes, with small improvements I'd developed. The business had grown beyond what Eleanor had managed. Online orders. Wholesale accounts with boutiques. A small but loyal following who appreciated quality and authenticity. I'd named it Eleanor's Legacy, and every product carried a small tag explaining the story. A grandmother's recipes. A granddaughter's promise. Handmade with love and memory. People responded to that authenticity. Orders increased steadily. I'd hired 2 part-time workers. Rented a small commercial kitchen space for larger batches. What had been Eleanor's hobby was becoming my career. And every day, working with her recipes and her methods, I felt connected to her. Like she was still teaching me. Still guiding me. Still proud of what I was building. One customer had sent a note with her order. "My grandmother raised me too. Reading your story made me cry. Thank you for honoring her this way." I'd kept that note pinned above my workspace. A reminder that Eleanor's impact extended beyond just me. That love and legacy mattered. That the people who tried to erase us would always fail, because real love leaves marks that can't be forged or stolen or destroyed. A year after Eleanor's death, I'd been sitting in the kitchen drinking tea when an envelope arrived. No return address. Denise's handwriting on the front. I'd stared at it for a long time before opening it. Inside was a single card. 2 sentences written in her familiar scrawl. I'm sorry for what I did. Can we talk? I'd read it 3 times. Felt absolutely nothing. No anger. No curiosity. No desire to respond or engage or give her any opening back into my life. Some people believed in reconciliation. In healing and moving forward and forgiving the unforgivable. I believed in boundaries. In protecting yourself from people who'd proven they'd hurt you. In understanding that some broken things weren't meant to be fixed. Denise had made her choices. She'd plotted and schemed and tried to steal everything Eleanor had wanted me to have. She'd dismissed my grief, mocked my relationship with my grandmother, celebrated what she'd thought was my loss. An apology didn't undo any of that. It didn't earn her access to my peace. I'd walked to the fireplace and dropped the card into the flames. Watched it curl and blacken and turn to ash. Then I'd returned to my tea, to the cookbook I'd been reading, to the quiet life I'd built in Eleanor's house. The silence between Denise and me wasn't absence. It was a choice. My choice. The power of simply walking away from people who'd proven they didn't deserve your presence. That was the final lesson Eleanor had taught me. Not revenge. Not destruction. Just the quiet strength of saying, no more, and meaning it. I stood in Eleanor's kitchen, my kitchen now, watching morning light stream through the windows she'd loved. The charm bracelet jingled on my wrist as I measured flour for her famous scones. Sunday morning ritual. Tea brewing. Birds singing in the garden. Everything exactly as it should be. There was a photo on the refrigerator. Me and Eleanor at my college graduation, her arm around my shoulders, both of us beaming at the camera. She'd been so proud that day. So convinced I could do anything. You're going to change the world, she'd told me. I hadn't changed the world. But I'd honored her memory. Kept her promises. Built something meaningful from what she'd left me. The business was thriving. Haven House had sent photos of the new women's wing, dedicated in Eleanor's name. Women finding safety and support because my grandmother had believed in lifting others. I'd learned so much from what Denise had tried to do. About protecting yourself. About documenting everything. About the importance of clear legal documents and trusted advisors. About how people who seem family can sometimes be your greatest threat. But mostly, I'd learned about love. Real love, the kind Eleanor had shown me, didn't need manipulation or control. It didn't demand or steal or erase. It simply gave. Freely, fully, unconditionally. Denise had tried to erase me from Eleanor's story. To rewrite history so I'd never existed in my grandmother's heart. But Eleanor had made sure that couldn't happen. Had left me not just money or property, but proof. Proof that I'd mattered. That I'd been loved. That I'd been chosen. I poured my tea and sat at the kitchen table, the same spot where Eleanor and I had shared countless mornings. The scones were in the oven, filling the house with warmth and the scent of home. Outside, the garden she'd planted bloomed with life. Inside, her legacy lived on in every corner, every recipe, every memory. Denise had wanted to take this from me. Had plotted and schemed and forged documents to steal what was rightfully mine. She'd seen me as invisible. Unimportant. Easy to erase. She'd been wrong about everything. Because Eleanor had seen me. Had valued me. Had made sure that even after death, I would know exactly how much I'd mattered to her. That was the real inheritance. Not the house or the money or the business. But the absolute certainty that I'd been loved without conditions. That I'd been enough. That I'd never been invisible. I sipped my tea and smiled, Eleanor's charm bracelet catching the morning light. I miss you, Grandma, I whispered to the empty kitchen that didn't feel empty at all. But thank you. For everything. For loving me. For protecting me. For making sure I'd never forget that I mattered. The timer went off. The scones were ready. I pulled them from the oven, golden and perfect, exactly the way Eleanor had taught me. Life went on. Better and brighter and more purposeful than Denise had ever imagined it could. She'd tried to erase me from Eleanor's will. But Eleanor had made sure I'd never be invisible again.